Typically, this is the time of year where I would be coming around and giving legislative updates on all of the things that we were able to accomplish in the General Assembly last session, and maybe forecasting some of the good things that we hope to do next session. But, I would be remiss to not acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances that we have had to deal with over the course of the past 7 months, and to kind of emphasize the impact that has had from a public policy making standpoint. We had a lot of good things coming down the pike last session that we were unable to get to because our legislative session was shortened, so to speak, by the COVID-19 crisis, and more aptly the way that our governor has handled that crisis. And there have been a lot of challenges. I sit on transportation, for instance, and after session, one of the most stark realities that I had to face is whenever I sat down in a meeting and we discovered that there was a 43% reduction in road fund receipts. We knew that there were going to be a lot of challenges in terms of revenue that would be generated for the state and things of that nature. But, only now, some 7 months later, have we really begun to get some kind of an idea of what the impact will be. But I want to go back to March. I want to go back to March and, just kind of describe where I was at mentally, where some of my colleagues were at mentally, and where I think that we all were collectively across the Commonwealth. At that time, we'd begun to hear about a coronavirus in China, and then we heard about it spreading to Italy and to other areas. And I don't know about you all, but I was concerned. I was seeing the images on television of people being quarantined and whole towns being shut down, and frankly, people perishing from this illness. I was worried about it. And, if many of you all are like me, maybe you went to the grocery store and you got yourself some extra groceries and stocked up on things. Maybe you went to the bank and got some extra money out and did everything that you could to be prepared. Now, my core philosophy, because I'm a conservative legislator, is that it's not the role of the government to take care of me or to provide for me, but that's my individual responsibility to take care of myself. And I feel like a lot of Kentuckians did that at that time, but nevertheless, the fear was there. The fear of the unknown, the fear of this virus that we hadn't had, because we've had viruses before. I don't know if many of you all remember H1N1. That was very scary at that time. We've had things like that, but this seemed different at the offset of it and at the beginning of it. But sometime around March, mid-March, as a matter of fact, it became apparent to me that our governor, Governor Andy Beshear, was heading down a path in handling this COVID-19 crisis that, in my opinion, forayed into executive overreach. It was a path that unnecessarily restricted commerce, that shut down 2/3 of Kentucky's economy, and frankly infringed upon our civil liberties and some of our constitutional rights. And, at that time, as a member of the General Assembly, and in the context of conversations that I had with my colleagues, many of us were very concerned about this because, yes, we have this unknown public health crisis, this public health issue that we don't know what's going to happen. But we also know that even in the context of a virus, our constitutional rights should never be suspended. So at that time, I filed an amendment to a House bill that I had that had already been through the committee process and could have been heard on the House floor. I filed an amendment with the hope of restoring an appropriate balance of power among the three co-equal branches of government, to create a system of checks and balances in the event that some of these executive orders unnecessarily restricted commerce. And, hindsight's 20/20. But a lot of the things that I was concerned about specifically is the fact that so many of our small and locally owned businesses were forced to shut down during this time. The big box businesses, which it's not to diminish the importance of the larger businesses by any means, but still there seemed to be some type of arbitrary approach as to what could stay open, what was an essential business, because in my opinion, any business that enables a Kentuckian to put food on the table and to provide for their families is an essential business. And, at that time, it became apparent to me that we were really going to have an issue with that. And then, of course, as far as our First Amendment rights, the ability to attend church, to attend religious services, and to assemble was being infringed upon at that time. I recall at one point the Kentucky State Police were charged with writing down the license plates of folks who just showed up to church on Easter Sunday. And you can imagine that as a conservative legislator, that was a cause of great concern for me because, again, you have this situation where, yes, you want to address public health concerns. You want to be responsible. You want to do everything you can to be wise. But I'm of the opinion that we do not need the government to tell us and to make those decisions for us. We have the ability as thinking individuals to make those decisions for ourselves and for our families. And, on those matters that I've spoken of, as far as businesses being closed down and as far as our First Amendment rights being infringed upon, and also the interstate travel ban, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, those matters have been taken up in courts, and victories have ensued by judges at every level. Now, granted, we're still waiting on the results of how our Kentucky Supreme Court is going to rule on that issue, as well as various aspects of the mask mandate. We don't know how that's going to play out yet, but in Boone County and in Scott County as well, judges have weighed in and said, no, this is not the appropriate use of the force of government to enact some of these mandates that Governor Beshear has. And, a lot of people want to look at this through the political lens and say, well, of course, some members of the Republican, the House Majority Caucus or the Senate Majority Caucus are going to be adversarial toward this governor because of politics. And I understand that's a fair indictment, but in reality, this is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. This is an issue of freedom. This is an issue of drawing that line between having the ability to have the authority over your own life and how you live it versus what the government tells you to do. Many of you all who are members of the business community understand very acutely the consequences when that line is not clearly drawn, or more importantly, when that line is breached. And at that time, just a little bit about that amendment, we weren't able to pass that in the General Assembly because the governor was able to foment quite a bit of fear and hysteria to a certain extent about this virus and what the implications were. He took data from other states. He took worst case scenarios and things of that nature to kind of instill this fear. And frankly, he used shame as well. I don't know if many of you all heard some of the remarks where he said you're going to get your grandparents killed if you attend or visit a swimming pool. Just things like that. There were a lot of rhetorical exchanges that frankly I think are beneath the dignity of what we would expect out of a governor. But, that's unfortunately the nature of politics. But, moving forward, I think that it's really important to understand, and it's not to diminish the impact that the coronavirus has had on our state or our nation, but, here right now in Kentucky, since March, we have had 2.2 million Kentuckians apply for unemployment since March. 2.2. That is 54% of our entire workforce has applied for unemployment since March. Now, I spend most of my days every week, and this is the same for every one of my colleagues, talking with folks who have applied for these benefits, these unemployment benefits that they've paid into and haven't received the first time since March. Now, some situations in some cases are better than others, but the reality is, and you can look this up on the internet, the media is actually surprisingly open about the fact that responses from the labor cabinet have all but grinded to a halt to members of the General Assembly, to myself. Whenever I reach out to them about a constituent and say, okay, what's going on with this case? The reason that it's grinded to a halt is because they are so inundated and we're under-equipped to deal with 54% of the entire workforce being out of a job. It's unprecedented. We've never heard of anything like that. But I would say it did not need to be that way. It did not need to be that way. We did not need to shut down Kentucky's economy. How many businesses will never open their doors again? In my district alone, I see, and particularly restaurants have been hit very hard for having been reduced to their capacity reduced so much, and having to jump through all these hoops, so forth, so on. And, I understand that there's a desire to prevent the spread of communicable disease, but at what cost? At what cost whenever we have decimated the economy? And let's talk about education for a minute. These kids and the public school system. Now, you all are probably aware of the fact that Kentucky was not necessarily in the top percentiles in terms of public education anyway prior to all this. We had our challenges. We still do. But the learning gap that has ensued as a result of having these kids to not be able to attend in-person learning, and especially our special needs kids. That's something that I hadn't even really pondered until I had the opportunity to spend some time with one of my constituents from down in the Morning View area, and the challenges that family had faced, because a lot of the special needs students require that structure that school provides. And whenever you sit them behind a laptop or a computer for 8 hours out of the day, 6 hours, there's some breaks in there, so forth, so on. Every curriculum is different. They're not adjusted well to that. And this learning gap, I think that we're going to continue to see that. And I'm seeing where some schools, for instance, Fayette County, said that they may not return to full in-person instruction until there's a vaccine that's available, which begs all kinds of questions. But, what we passed last session to allow this NTI, which is non-traditional instruction, that's where the children are at home learning instead of in the actual classroom, that's only good till the end of the year. So there's a lot of public schools that are not going to receive their SEEK funding if we don't do something. But frankly, I think that our kids do need to be in school. I think that they need to move forward. And all of the data suggests that children are not impacted by this virus the same way that folks over 60 or 65 or folks who are immunocompromised are. So, they need to be there for that. But, after everything that we have been through over the course of the past 7 months, and obviously there's going to be shortfalls in the budget, because last session we only passed a one-year budget where typically it's a biennial budget. We're going to be tasked with coming back during a 30-day and passing yet another budget. And the reason that we did that only for 1 year is because we knew that we had no way of knowing what we were going to be working with. How can you make projections whenever you're shutting down significant portions of the economy? You just can't do it. And the fact that, like I say, 43% reduction in road fund receipts, we don't know what we're going to be working with in terms of transportation projects. We've heard all kinds of rumors. Is paving and this was back in like August. Is it done for the year? Just all kinds of stuff that it's and the lack of communication as well, that I feel like not just Republican members of the General Assembly, but also on the other side of the aisle, they have talked about a lack of communication between the legislative and executive branch. So, there are issues there. But, in light of everything that we have seen come to fruition over the course of the past 7 months, moving forward, I have filed BR 130. Many of you all may have heard of that, but what it would do is it says that in the event of a state of emergency, like we've seen, in the event that some of these executive orders that are being mandated to us, in the event that they surpass a 2-week time frame, that the General Assembly will be called back into session at that time. And the reason that I did that is one of the chief complaints that I've heard from folks in my district and all over the Commonwealth is they say, well, with businesses being shut down and with our constitutional rights being infringed upon, what can the General Assembly do? Well, the answer is, whenever we're out of session, nothing. We can use our voices. I can use my media presence. I can use the power of the pen, so to speak, to write about what I'm seeing, to describe it. But legislatively, there's nothing that we can do to attenuate the influence of executive overreach. So for that reason, that's what BR 130 would do. And a lot of people have asked, because the General Assembly cannot call itself back into session. Under the Kentucky Constitution, that is not something we have the authority to do. But the way that I have crafted this bill is it says that the governor, if he or she wants to extend that executive order, they must call us back into session in order to be able to do it. And I did a 2-week time frame. I also have addressed the Cabinet for Health and Family Services in that bill because it's become apparent to me that they also have had, in my opinion, as unelected individuals who are appointed or hired for those positions, they've had an inordinate amount of power over our lives throughout this process. So I've also tried to address them and to include specific protections for some of the rights that have been infringed upon. And it says that in terms of business owners, I think that this has a particular appeal, that these emergency orders issued during a state of emergency, it's actually what I've done there is I've taken an executive order issued under KRS 39A. It becomes an emergency order. And what it does is those have to be narrowly tailored so that they cannot unnecessarily restrict commerce. And the burden is upon the executive branch, upon the governor, to prove that it is necessary and cannot be dealt with at the local or regional level, that it's necessary to have that state of emergency to shut down that business. Otherwise, those businesses have recourse. And my reason for doing that is in hopes of restoring an appropriate balance of power among the co-equal branches of government, because I've had a lot of folks, both sides of the aisle, approach me and say, well, in their words, this governor's gone off the rails. He's drunk on power. I've heard that so much. And again, not a political issue. That's just what I have heard from folks on both sides of the aisles. And they're concerned that could continue to foray into that path of big government overreach. And on that subject, a lot of folks have also reached out to me for fear of a particular statute. It's called KRS 214.036 that gives the Cabinet for Health and Family Services the ability to forcibly vaccinate Kentuckians. Now, in normal times, there are exemptions for vaccinations. If you have health issues, if you have moral objections, religious objections, so forth, so on, you can refuse a vaccine. But under this particular statute, it says that the cabinet can forcibly vaccinate anyone in the area of an epidemic, and there are no exemptions. So I have BR 301, which would create an exemption, and it would remove that power from the cabinet. Because, on the subject of this vaccine, I've read a lot about this. And this is being the most rapidly developed vaccine of our entire lifetime. Typically, vaccines take over a decade. The quickest vaccine to ever develop was the mumps vaccine, and I believe that took just over 4 years to do that. So, here we are talking about such a quick time frame, and I actually spoke with my physician about this subject the other day, and he had a certain level of confidence in the new technology that they were using to develop this vaccine. But the bottom line is, it's not the role of the government to tell its citizens whether they should or should not receive a vaccine, to force them to take it. They should be able to make that decision for themselves in light of the research that they've done, conversations that they've had with their physician. And, it has never been about opposing vaccination or promoting vaccination for me. It's about restoring that choice to the individual to let them make that decision for themselves. Because, I firmly believe that all of our systems of government are first predicated upon the consent of the governed. And I think that's something we've lost sight of. In a way, we've ceded a level of our own autonomy to the government and said, take care of me, make decisions for me. And I don't think that's what it means to be an American. I don't think that that's what it means to value liberty and to value freedom. And, it's not to say that we don't want to keep an appropriate balance in our society and to have respect for law and order and all of the things that allow us to maintain that freedom and that liberty. I get that, but at the same time, that balance needs to be there. So I've probably talked long enough, but I just want to thank you all so much, and we'll eat, and then I'll take questions from you. Our first question is, what is your take on giving up your freedom for safety? You will have neither safety nor freedom. Well, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. And, I think that kind of harkens back to the fact that this KRS 39A that we're talking about, it was never intended to shut down an entire state's economy, for instance. Whenever KRS 39A was enacted, the kind of state of emergency that it had in mind, its intent was for tornadoes, ice storms, flooding, things of that nature, more regional emergencies. So, I think that kind of has made a lot of us think, what are we willing to give up for quote unquote safety? And, do you think that the government is ever really truly in a place to make you 100% safe, to shield you from some of the maladies of life? That's a good question. But in reality, no, I don't think that we should ever give up our freedom in exchange for safety, given that it's not that necessarily the role of government in certain circumstances to guarantee that anyway. So thank you for that question. All right, my next question. Who can vote for me? And then, do you have a campaign? Okay, yeah. On that subject, I have the good fortune of running unopposed this cycle. Typically, this would be the year that I would be up for election, and my name will be on the ballot. But as far as who could vote for me, my district goes from Independence south in Kenton County, which geographically, I actually have the largest district in Kenton County, but population-wise, some of the northern areas, of course, are more densely populated. And then I have all of Grant, a little bit of Boone County, the Verona, South Walton area, and then I actually have a little bit of Scott County down into Georgetown. It's a very interesting district, so that's who. But I am running unopposed, and I've been trying to use this time to help out other folks and just really dig in deep and be ready for a very aggressive legislative session next time. So thank you for that question. Please explain 39A and the judge executive versus governor's authority and your bill to deal with emergency management decisions in the future. Well, that's a great question. I have heard this from a lot of judge executives that feel like their ability to handle this situation has been superseded by the governor's authority. And we have seen a variety of responses in states. In some circumstances, judge executives do not feel as though the restrictions are appropriate for the amount of cases that they have in their county, perhaps the more rural counties. They feel it's too restrictive. And for that reason, they're frustrated. And as the way that I understand KRS 39A, I don't think that it was appropriate for this overarching. And, at the risk of sounding caustic, I think that this governor's the first governor to misuse that statute in that way. But in other states, something that we've seen governors do is that they've actually had to pass, well, they're not passing anything. Governors don't legislate, or at least they shouldn't. Neither should courts. But anyway, some of the executive orders that they have issued have dealt with preemption, meaning that if counties and municipalities want to make more restrictive regulations, that they can't do that. So in some states, that's been the issue. Here in Kentucky, I can't imagine that any of our counties would actually want to make things more restrictive than Governor Andy Beshear has. But in the context of BR 130, there's a specific portion in there that says that if the executive order, if it surpasses the 2-week time frame, that only the judge executive or the heads of the local county could be able to on an individual basis. So that's one aspect. And I think that there's a conversation to be had about how that power breaks down, because generally speaking, I do believe in local control and handling things at the local issue as opposed to a overarching statewide approach. So, I mean, I definitely am open to that dialogue, because whenever we're talking about KRS 39A reform, it's a gargantuan task, and it's something that simply must be done. I am confident that it will be a top priority for us this next session. It's going to get accomplished. It's just a function of, it's going to be very imperative that our local business owners speak up and make the General Assembly understand the impact that this has had on business and on the economy at large, and to make sure that these reforms are substantive enough. How does COVID-19 impact the pension crisis? Nobody's talking about the pension right now. Have you noticed that? There's probably a really good reason for that, because estimates vary anywhere from $44 to a $60 billion unfunded pension liability as we were coming into this past session. And in our budget, we fully funded our the ARC payment, and We even did a little bit more, I believe, on KERS because we actually had a special session to deal with KERS, which is the worst funded pension system at 13% funded, whereas KTRS, I believe, is 54% funded. I don't have revenue projections to really understand what our unfunded liability is going to be in light of all this. I don't have that data in front of me at this time, but I could tell you it's not going to be good for it. I mean, when the state as a whole is going to be hurting for revenue, the only thing about it, though, is our stock market's done some funny things, because whenever we're talking about pensions, obviously that plays a factor in it as well. On that side, as far as the investment side, I don't know how that will end up faring, and that could even really change a lot in November. So I mean, we're just in incredibly volatile times. We all know that, but I don't feel that we've gotten any further in addressing the pension crisis. It's not going to go away. That's not a politically expedient thing to say to you, but it is a reality. And we're going to have to deal with it at some point, and it's certainly not to say that we don't want to meet our obligations, because we have to. Not only are we required to, but it's just the right thing to do. But there's going to need to be reform. So, can you talk about the potential budget nightmare and how you might deal with it? Well, the only way that you deal with a budget nightmare is cuts. That's the only appropriate way to deal with a budget nightmare. The governor, whenever he took office, talked a lot about how he wanted to implement raises for certain people, and those certain people never got the raises. They're never going to get the raises. He talked about a lot of spending that he wanted to do, but the irony of all of this is that he actually has had to cut budgets. He's had to cut budgets for higher ed, for a variety of departments, cabinets, so forth, so on, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, in my lifetime, that's probably some of the more austere cuts that I've ever seen a Democrat have while holding public office in Kentucky, just to be perfectly honest, but it's still not going to be enough. Before this COVID thing ever happened, we already had issues with our budget in terms of revenue, and the answer was not, is not, and will never be, in my opinion, to raise your taxes, because we should be able to make do with what we have. And if we can't, then we need to cut. Because I don't know how you feel, but I feel like I pay out the nose through taxes. And I understand this is Kentucky. We're not taxed like other states are necessarily, but there's still room for growth on the production side of our taxes. That's higher. We're not competitive with Indiana, with Tennessee. And I use those because, when everybody talks about moving away from production, moving away from the income tax, they think of Texas and Florida. We don't have beaches, we don't have Disney World, and we're not Texas. I get that. But Indiana and Tennessee are comparable, and I think that there is some room there that we do need to lower that income and look at other options, but it should never result in a net raise of your taxes. And, I encourage you to continue to oppose those efforts. Frankly, whether it's a local ops and sales tax, or any other tax structure, look at it closely. Moving from production towards consumption is not bad, but it has to be proportional. It has to be proportional and not raising your taxes, or else I don't think it's an appropriate thing to do, because Kentuckians are already hurting. I'm hearing about this gas tax where they're already starting to ramp up the efforts for that again, and I know that's a controversial subject, I do. But, here we are with 54% of Kentucky's workforce having applied for unemployment since March, and we're talking about a new tax. We can't be doing that. Sorry, don't mean to paraphrase someone, but really, can't be doing that as a General Assembly. I don't think it's the appropriate course of action. So, cuts. That's how. Sorry.
2 minutes for closing remarks.
All right. Oh, yeah. I think I got through all the questions, so that's great. No, I just want to thank you all so very much for the opportunity to speak. I've really enjoyed it, and I am so encouraged to see people out doing things and getting back together, because we need the free exchange of ideas in society. I worry about whenever everything's shut down and all we're doing is sitting behind a computer, and we continue to have these thoughts and opinions on the things that are happening around us, but we're not exchanging them civilly. I think that if we want to restore civility to political discourse, this is how it happens. Thank you so much.